Billy Ray Whisenant. I was in the Marine Corps, and I was discharged as a sergeant. I was in the Vietnam War, 67 and 68, which is known as the Tet Offensive, which was one of the more combative type periods in Vietnam. All of it was combative, but they seemed to turn up the pressure a little bit at that particular time. So I was there. It wasn't for retirement. It was more the patriotic calling to serve. And I chose the Marine Corps because they had the advertisements, and at that time, as in most conflicts, they do appeal to the younger folks. I was just out of high school, and so I went down and joined up, and that's how I started. At that time, there were people in Vietnam, Marines in Vietnam, and I just felt like I should do my part and serve. That was my feelings on it. It's highly idealistic, wasn't well researched, or I might have had second thoughts, but at the time, that was my intention, was to go over and help out in any way that I could. Well, initially I went to Da Nang, and then from there I went to a place called Dong Ha. And from Dong Ha, there were two openings. One of them was at Con Tien, which is on the northernmost part of the demilitarized zone. And the other was at Dong Ha, which they called a rear area. But the rockets didn't recognize that as a rear area. So there were two of us, and the captain asked us, if we'd like to go, and I volunteered because I'd talked to the young man outside of the tent. He was married, just had a child, and my thinking at that time, and still would probably be true today, is that I was single, he was a married family man, so I chose to go to Con Tien. The timing of that was 2 weeks prior to me volunteering to go to Con Tien. There were pictures on either Time or Life magazine of a Marine Corps unit that got decimated coming over the hill of Con Tien on tanks, the bodies. So that was all in my 18-year-old mind at the time, but then I went to Con Tien. From Con Tien, I actually asked to go out into the field, which was called, in military term, Marine Corps terms, the bush. And the captain asked me, why do you want to go out into the field? And I said, I would rather go out into the field and be able to move around and be shot at by smaller bullets than I would to sit here and just wait for big bullets to fall on me. And this captain smiled. He said, I've never heard it put that way. And I said, well, that's the way I feel. So I got the transfer. Then for 8 months, I spent out in the field with 2nd Battalion, 9th Marines. At 6'6", as a forward observer radio operator with a 10-foot antenna in the middle of a DMZ being shot at, in retrospect, it probably wasn't the best of ideas. I jokingly tell people now, and I'm thankful that I can say this jokingly, I got shot at a lot. If you could imagine 6'6" with a 10-foot antenna, the reason for the 10-foot antenna was to reach back to the artillery to call in support for us. So the little 3-foot antennas wouldn't reach as far as we were out in the field, the DMZ, so I'd have to erect this whip antenna, and I stood out. I was pretty obvious out there, but for some reason they missed, so I'm glad. I don't have a really pat answer for that. I'm sure the fear was there, but it was just trying to pay attention, and it's hard to translate that for folks that haven't been in that situation. I was fortunate enough to write about those experiences in a book called White Blooms, and the reason I did that was to sort of get it out of me, and that helped a lot. It kept me from keeping it all internal, and it enabled me to look at it and to process it a little bit better. And I'm not a psychologist, but that seems to have helped me, along with some poetry And my aunt, who's still alive, saved 35 letters that I had written to her from Vietnam. 33 years after Vietnam, she called me and asked me if I'd like to have them. I didn't even know they existed. And I told her, yes, I would. And she said, you've got to get these published. And I reluctantly, I said, no, it's personal. Nobody wants to read this stuff. But as the years went by, I did. I transcribed my chicken scratch from those letters through a dictation program. A very humbling experience to read your thoughts as a 19-year-old person. If you go back from memory, you can be a lot more kind to yourself. But if you read your own words when you were 19, it's very humbling, very idealistic. But I was thankful that my aunt saved those. That little publication is called 35 Letters from Vietnam. And that now is a part of the Texas Tech virtual Vietnam library in Texas. They accepted that, and it's categorized and available up there through their archives. So I was happy about that, not so much proud, but for my aunt, because she was still here, and I got to send her the copies of that. And in the introduction, I mentioned that she had saved them, so that was a very good experience for me, helpful. Well, survival, I think, would be the best answer for that. You never knew what was going to happen. It wasn't 24 hours a day combat. There were operations. I participated in 16 major combat operations, and every one of them was different to some extent. My story that I've wore people out with was I physically was shot off of a tank on January the 24th of 1968. 55 of us rode in on some tanks, and we rode into what's called in the military a kill zone. Well, there were 55 of us and 1,200 North Vietnamese regular army on high ground, and we rode right into it. And so we were pinned down for quite some time, and it's documented in the history books that this was during the Khe Sanh siege time. They were trying to cut off the route to Khe Sanh and the support to Khe Sanh. We were just down the road from Khe Sanh, basically. So being shot off that tank, as far as motivation goes, none of those things occurred to you. I will say this, it's the only time to this point in my life that my life flashed before my eyes. I picked up a very small piece of shrapnel in my back as I was being propelled. As I jumped, a rocket-propelled grenade hit the other side of the tank, and the force, I flew across the ditch, basically. And the man on my left was severely wounded. The man on my right was deceased. And so I patched up the man on my left. We were under a lot of fire, a lot of combat. And 47 years later, through the internet, somebody had connected me with the man that was driving the tank that we rode into the ambush on. So that was pretty, not to overdo it, but that was pretty surreal, talking to a voice from 47 years ago that was right there at that time. And I told him that I was shot off the tank on the right side of the tank. He said, so was I. And I said, I bandaged the man's arm, I think I said his arm. Well, this voice from 47 years ago says that was my hand. So that was a really interesting emotional experience to realize that this was the man on the phone that I had helped the best I could patch his arm up. I think he received a Silver Star that day, and we talked briefly about that experience, and I have not heard from him since. And that's pretty indicative of a lot of Vietnam veterans. It's just the way it is. So, but back to your question about motivation, you don't have time to be motivated. You really do not. When they finally came to our rescue and helped us out of that. But when we pulled back to the middle of this dirt road, there were 7 of us from the original 55. And I didn't know that at the time, but we went down the road to the next village down the road where we had a Marine Corps compound called Cam Lo. And we got off the tanks. It was dark by this time. There was a street light. They had electricity. And myself and the officer that I served with, we were gathering around the street light, and the officer I was with looked up at one of the tankers, and he said, the officer I was with said, is this it? And the tanker said, that's all of your people. So at that time, I counted 7 people. So I think 9 men were killed in action. The rest were so severely wounded they had to be helicoptered or trucked out. So that night, that particular compound was under threat of being overrun. And I recall looking up at the sky, and a beautiful sky. Vietnam had the most beautiful skies, no ground light, just the heavens and the stars were just beautiful. Can't take that away from them. But when I looked up, my thought was, okay, that's enough. I've had enough for today. That's all I want. They didn't overrun us that night, but they were all in the area. It was a pretty big force of North Vietnamese that we were up against. So, and I always make apologies for this, Emmanuel, because I have a lot of stories, and I mentioned it at the rededication, the memorial. All the people there have stories. And to me, it's important to share those. For some, it's easier. For me, it's more of a reference to the history of my life. It happened. I don't mind sharing it. I don't know of what benefit it would be for anyone, but that's why I wrote the little book called White Blooms. And and my idea was, well, I'll put it in a book. If you want to read it, fine. But inevitably, and especially in an interview, I find myself apologizing because I know these stories, some folks can relate to them, but they're personal stories, and they're not meant to influence anybody. They're just a telling of a time in my life. As far as the poetry goes, to me it was the quickest way to access what I was feeling. And the poetry was not always, I only have a few poems about Vietnam, but it was a way to access my feelings in a really quick way, instead of writing out, I feel this way because of this, because of that. So that medium became very helpful to me. I don't know what it did for other folks, but it enabled me to, again, get through some of my feelings and express them. That's been very helpful to me. I actually wrote a piece in Vietnam, which was not poetry, it was prose, called Don't Fall Off, Get a Better Grip. And I wrote it specifically for my mother, who, when I left Houston to go to Vietnam, was in a hospital. And I wrote it to her, Don't fall off, get a better grip. When she passed away in 1999, I was going through her belongings, and in her wallet was that copy of Don't Fall Off, Get a Better Grip. So I've also found that in writing and expressing, you do have a tendency to connect with other people, not intentionally, but we all share similar feelings and emotions. And so that's always been a rewarding part of writing for me, is to get folks to make a comment or to say that it touched them, or a few people have even cried. I don't know if it's because my poetry was that bad or that good, but that's basically why I did the poetry, just a quick access to my feelings, and it's helped through the years. I don't write as much poetry anymore. Yeah, I brought it. I'll preface that just a little bit. I wrote this after getting off a bus in Houston, Texas. A young child was looking at me eye to eye, not ashamed, not afraid, just curious child. And I just engaged in eye contact with that child. I got off the bus and I went to the apartment that I was living in at the time, and I wrote this little piece called Look at the Children's Eyes. And look at the children's eyes. They're fascinated by simple things: ice cream, the sky, butterfly wings. They seem to miss nothing. To them, everything seems to be something. Circles of life that look so bright, using to their advantage their gift of sight. Responding to a smile, concerned about a frown, radiant and laughing at the clown. Look at the children's eyes. They see more than you, with no words to explain what they see. There's still a child in me. They see colors and lights through those circles of life. Look at the children's eyes, everything new, a surprise. Eyes that cry, eyes that search, eyes that sleep in church. Circles of life that search for something new, something bright. And that was inspired by a child on a bus.
Wow.
Thank you for asking me to read that. I don't read poetry out loud very much.
That's amazing.
You know, it goes against the Marine Corps. It's not enough.
And then is that the other one?
I do have another one. This is the one I mentioned to you. You can have that if you'd like it.
I love that. Thank you very much.
This one is important to me, and I'll try to be as emotionless as possible. I just recently lost a good friend, Douglas Burge, combat medic, 2 Bronze Stars, Purple Heart, just an exemplary, fine human being. But I wrote this for 2 medics that served in Vietnam, and I wrote this several years ago. This has been published. It's called Corpsman Up. And I once called for a corpsman in Vietnam on a hill called Con Tien. And for the tour I did, the time I spent, I'd hear that call again and again. A man lay dying. He took a rocket blast from about 15 yards. No one heard it coming, the one that was supposed to kill you. I changed the frequency of my radio. And said, Corpsman up at the LZ. LZ stands for landing zone. A man down or something to that effect. Then peered out of the bunker through the rest of that rocket attack. The man hit was in such pain as he lay there bleeding in the rocket rain. The corpsman came running with his bag of patches and painkillers, his heart full of compassion and care. He knelt over the man. Rocket still coming, and tended to him the best he could. That corpsman saved a man's life that day by risking his own. Corpsman up. Without you, there would be more names on the wall. Corpsman up. God bless you for answering the call. I was pretty unsettled, and that was a common side effect, if you will, or symptom of post-traumatic stress, is the inability to really stay at anything for any length of time. It's just something that wasn't discovered until later. Well, the Vietnam veterans were well aware of it, but it had never been really put in publications and recognized and researched. So I did some sales work. I'm not a very good salesman. I did warehouse work. I did quite a few things, just sustaining myself. I was single for all that time. And I finally stumbled into operating cranes. And by that time, I'd already sifted through a lot of those things that we all had to endure out of the Vietnam War. And I ended up in tower cranes. My highest tower crane was in Austin, Texas at 540 feet up above the city skyline. And I really enjoyed operating cranes. It took me to Kuwait. I got to go to Kuwait as a crane operator and help put out the fires in 1990. So I finally settled on cranes, but I had a multitude of, I wouldn't say, the word escapes me right now, professions or occupations. I had a lot of them, but I was never really comfortable with any of them until I did get into the cranes. And that's what I retired as a crane operator. So it's been interesting.
Yeah.
Well, unless you ride a motorcycle, I've had this conversation with other folks, riders and non-riders, and it's more of a connection, an outdoor, more of a sensory thing. You definitely have to pay attention, but the sights, the scenery, of course you can't be wandering all around looking, but the smells, the fragrances of the flowers, unfortunately the stench of a skunk, but it's more of a feeling of freedom. It's more of a feeling of not being constrained, or entrapped is not the correct word, but in a cage is what motorcycle riders refer to automobiles and trucks as the cage. I don't take it that far. I just like to ride a motorcycle because it's fun and it feels good. However, as I'm getting older, the probability that I'll probably sell my bike is coming up soon. I'm going to have to give it up for age and comfort and all that. I'm getting old and soft, or I may have been old and soft for a long time, but I still enjoy riding. Not so much in the rain and the cold like today, but it's just a feeling of freedom. You're pretty much, I call it a really inexpensive therapy, and that to me is part of why I enjoy riding. You're alone, you have your own thoughts, you have the beautiful scenery that we have here in the valley and on the coast, and it's just a nice experience. It's fun, but it's not for everybody. A lot of folks don't want to ride on motorcycles, and my time is coming to an end on that. My wife's granddaughter has cystic fibrosis. And we were in Central California and just thought that it would be a good idea to be more accessible to my wife's daughter and granddaughter and grandchildren by being in this area versus the distance and the time and the expense. So primarily that was our reason to come to Independence. And it's been such a joyous experience for us. Our granddaughter is doing much, much better. And she's in a marching band, playing a trombone. Nike Corporation, she designed a Nike shoe when she was up at Dornbecker. So she's doing exceptionally well, and it's been very good to have my wife closer to family and get to participate in that, graduations and things of that nature. So, but like I said, we had no idea what Independence was about. One thing I'll say is an old friend of mine, when they said, where are you at and where did you move to in Oregon? And I said, Independence. And this long, long ago friend of mine said, of course you did. Which I thought was a great response. She said, of course you did. Like, where else would you go? That memorial, and historically most folks know this, but if they don't, was hand built by 3 Vietnam veterans. So that drew me to that, not initially, but through meeting folks with the AMVETS post in Monmouth, which is now no longer in existence, and dealing with them, I just took an interest in it and realized that the last time that memorial had been cleaned was by the auxiliary ladies from the AMVETS post. Well, I still know, I don't know if I should use her name or not, and probably should not, but a lady that was the president of the auxiliary and some other ladies hand carried buckets of water and brushes and soap across the street from the vet center, the veterinarian place there, and hand cleaned it. So to me, even though AMVETS was no longer here, that particular memorial deserved more attention. So we contracted a local pressure washing business, and they came and cleaned it. And as far as involvement goes, I have asked that if the city could possibly work that into maybe twice a year. The tree sap falls on the memorial. The bricks get grungy, the benches get covered with birds. So hopefully the city will be able to help us out with that. And I'm not trying to plug for all that, but my interest in that specifically is that it is through our research, through the museum personnel researching, and through my research through archives, this is supposed to be the oldest Vietnam Veterans Memorial in the state of Oregon, the first. And it's not even listed as such. I've made some inquiries and presented the information that was accumulated, and now it's listed as the Vietnam Veterans Memorial first in the state of Oregon. So, and it was really nice on the rededication. On July the 3rd of this year was the 40th year of this memorial. And Mayor McCardle came and spoke. I had a few things to say, and there was a great turnout, veterans, a bunch of old folks like me for the most part. But I believe, I know I was appreciative of that. I was appreciative of the city for doing that and working with us on that and helping that to become a reality. So things like that I really enjoy, and that memorial was just a focal point. But it brought folks together. It brought community together. It brought awareness, at least to some extent, to that particular memorial. And I don't use the word pride a lot, but I am kind of proud that we did get some attention to that memorial and to the veterans. And before I forget it, and I know you may have to cut this short because I can be long-winded, but for the families of the veterans, there's a lot of emphasis on veterans, but the veterans' families have to go through quite a bit as well. They have to support, try to understand in certain situations like combat veterans like myself, you don't come back the same, and everyone is aware of that. So it's the families ultimately that are the support system in addition to, you know, the services that are provided for the veteran that really has to bear the brunt a lot of taking care and helping the veterans to reacclimate, if you will, back into non-combat situations. And it takes a little bit of effort. So my thanks are to the families for what they do for the veterans too, all families. These, this is Rifle Expert, the story behind that as well. That's from boot camp. The one on the top is a Navy accommodation with a combat V. There's a combat action ribbon. There's a naval unit citation. There's a good conduct award. There's also a Vietnamese Cross of Gallantry and a Vietnamese, there's a Vietnamese campaign. They're just representative of what I was awarded. A lot of them are pretty standard national defense ribbon. All servicemen, when they go into whatever their branch, they get a national defense, and then you go from there. And so I don't wear these so much, I guess, to boast or to brag or to say, hey, look at me. But when I came back from Vietnam, I gave all my medals away. I gave the medals away, I gave the certificates away, I gave everything. I just didn't want to be a part of it. And my son, when he was probably maybe 8 or 9 years old, we were at a quartermaster place in Arizona that sold, you know, little pins like my Marine Corps pin, things like that. And there was a chart on the wall, and it had the listings of the various branches, accommodations, and awards and medals. And I just happened to glance at it, waiting for the salesperson to come back, and my son was there, and I said, oh, I've got that one. He said, you do? And so as I realized he was interested in it, I started seeing the ones that I was awarded. And so for him, I went through the Department of Navy and ordered all those. They will provide those for you if you request them. And they sent them to me. I put them in a display case, and I gave them to him when he was much older. Well, it seems this year is a little different for me. There seems to be more emphasis on it this year, and it could just be me. It could be an internal thing for me, but it seems people are more aware of this, the Operation Greenlight, the proclamation that the mayor read. There just seems to be more of an interest in veterans, this particular Veterans Day. For me, November the 10th is the Marine Corps birthday. So we have the Marine Corps birthday, it'll be 246 years, and then the next day is Veterans Day. So when I was in boot camp, the saying at that time was 200 years of tradition unhampered by progress. So I would like to think they've had more progress by now, but Veterans Day to me, it's always good to bring recognition to the veterans, but in my opinion, we're not really anything special. We served our country, and as a Vietnam veteran, I I am not very used to getting thank yous and being complimented and being recognized. That's changed to some extent, but that initial, experience that most of us encountered lingers. It lingers. So it's nice for me as a veteran, a Vietnam veteran specifically, to see that people seem to be more genuinely accepting of Vietnam veterans now, and all veterans, and Afghanistan, bless their hearts, and Iraq. I mean, we all different conflicts, but the similarities are never going to change when you're being shot at by somebody trying to kill you. That's going to stay with you for a long time, and you having to defend yourself, and that, without getting too philosophical about it, when it comes down to combat, you're defending yourself and you're defending the people around you. And there's very few people that are going to jump up and wave an American flag. We're there on behalf of our country, but when it comes down to it, you're fighting for your friend next to you. And that's, I'm not trying to use that as a cliche, and I think that's pretty common knowledge, but that's a genuine feeling there. From someone that has been in combat, you're trying to protect yourself and, importantly, protect the people around you. It could be challenging. Just another quick story. I went to the Vietnam Wall in Washington and went to a reunion, men I hadn't seen in a long time. As I was walking down the wall, I turned the switch on and decided I wasn't going to cry, that I wasn't going to get emotional. And as I started to walk down the beginning of the wall, the thought came to me, no, these men deserve more than you being stone cold. They deserve some tears. So I cried. They got an etching of a friend of mine. I was with him on the last day he was there, and he'd actually asked me to take his place that day. And I had gone the time before. We had things called sparrowhawks, and that meant that somebody's in trouble, you've got to go bail them out. And we would alternate radio operators on each one of those. I went out the one before. It turns out it's the one that I was shot off the tank, so I wasn't really anxious to take his place, but unfortunately he died on that sparrowhawk. So his name was Marty Millick, and I remember him. He was a good kid. He was 19 years old. But when he asked me, he'd been up, drinking and playing poker, and he had a bad hangover. And I remember looking down at him, and he's looking up at me, and I said, no, Marty, I said, it's your turn. And he understood that. He said, I know. But he was just trying to get out of it because he felt bad. So unfortunately, he lost his life that day. So bless his heart, so many people did. But some of us, they missed. I don't know how, but I told a VA doctor once in Tucson, I said, bless their hearts, they tried to kill me, but they didn't have any luck. The doctor laughed. He said, I've never heard it put that way. I said, I've never said it that way. But it's true. They were doing what they thought they should be doing, so were we. So I can't speak for all veterans, but for me, the majority of veterans that I've met, they're not out for recognition. They're not out for applause. They're just citizens, and they served this country, and the majority of them served it honorably. And so they're not really looking for all that much recognition. However, speaking for myself, it is nice to feel that a community does appreciate what you have done. I stay away from the word sacrifice because we did this volunteering. We asked a lot of us asked to go do this. So any sacrifices that were made, it was because we made that choice. And I don't see it as a sacrifice. I see it as a part of a learning process, of a growing process, of just, life, the ups and the downs. The one thing, if you could afford me to say, is the book White Blooms. I mentioned this at the rededication of the memorial. When I first went to Vietnam, I mentioned I was in Dong Ha. Well, I was waiting to go to Con Thien, and an old-timer, somebody that had been in Nam for a little bit of time, we had 13 months was our tour, asked me if I wanted to go to Graves registration. And I didn't have anything to do. It was kind of boring, and I said, okay. So I got in a Jeep, and I went down to a tent with a dirt floor. and walked in. And inside this tent, I walked past 12 dead young men. Some I can remember seeing the toe tag. Some of them, body parts were beside them. Some of them were zipped up. Some of them were not. But I remember clearly counting 12. I don't know why I counted, but there were 12 young men fixing to, they were preparing to send them home. So this was the first time I'd ever seen death. This was the first time the reality of where I was at and what was possibly going to happen set in. It will get your attention very quickly. So these are my thoughts as I walked out of this dirt floored tent. And off to my left, there was a scraggly old dead bush, which was really in keeping with where my mentality was at the time. But there was one white flower on that bush. And at the young age of 19, I say it this way and I mean it this way, the gift that I received was the thought that as long as I can perceive that one white flower, I'm still here. And I'm going to do everything that I can to remain here, because I just come to the understanding and the reality of what not being here is. It's a horrendous feeling, and I don't say this to any other reason than it actually happened. But as the years have gone by, that white flower has come to me to represent that no matter how bad things are around you, and that could be finances, it could be family illness, family death, a multitude of things can distract you in life and get you a little bit depressed. But my thinking has evolved from that one flower of staying here to keep perceiving that flower. That flower came to represent the beauty that is around us. And if we get distracted and forget to look for that symbol for me, that one white flower, that part that makes us appreciate what we have and that we're here, I think that's been a very important lesson for me to bring away from a horrible experience, is don't forget to look for the beauty that is still around you. And I've come to get a little more philosophical to believe the beauty that is still within you. Don't forget to look for that. It's still there. It doesn't go away. You might get distracted from seeing the things because of the distractions that we have. But try to be a little, for me, I can't speak for anybody or dictate or preach or any of that, but for me it's been helpful to look around for that beauty, look inside yourself and just appreciate that you're still here and there's still beauty around us. So that story I've tried to share with as many folks as I could, because it had a lot of meaning for me. And my daughter in California, from time to time, she'll say, "Daddy, you're still seeing the white blooms?" And I tell her, "Oh yeah, I'm still seeing them." So that's what I wanted to add.